What I find interesting is we're not talking about the physical. We're not talking about the physical aspect of a person because the physical aspect of a person was already addressed in the statement in verse 22 that the rich man died and buried and the poor man was buried. And yet we find that Abraham is telling him to recall. Remember that during your life you received good things. Remember that. Take those memories with you. Let them comfort you. How can he remember when there is no brain? How can he recall things? So, this tells us something about the nature of humanity concerning beyond the grave, that one retains their cognitive function even when they have no brain.
Welcome to The Renewed Mind, the podcast where we explore the world of biblical counseling and bridge the gap to a more holistic understanding of how scripture, psychology, and counseling intersect. The Renewed Mind is here to provide insightful discussions, interviews, and transformative ideas that align with the wisdom of scripture. And now your hosts, Dr. Luther Smith and Madeline Clark.
Hello, 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 hello. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are and whatever you are doing. This is the Renewed Mind podcast. I am your host. My name is Dr. Luther Smith. And as you can see, my partner in crime is not here. Actually, I would like to take a couple of minutes before we proceed along with the podcast to make an unfortunate announcement. So, speaking of my partner in crime, Maddie Madeline, just a great woman. She helped build the show, as a matter of fact. She has decided, due to some of the pressures of her master's program, she has decided to step down as co-host of The Renewed Mind. I cannot say that I'm not disappointed and sad for her stepping down, but the good news is that she will be back every now and then as a guest on the show. You know, when we first started this particular project, this was kind of an idea that was launched partly because we were having discussions about psychology in scripture. And she had asked me one time when we were in one of these discussions when I was going to start a podcast. And I said, well, I'm not going to start it unless you join me. And so it has been popular. And again, I'm going to miss her on the co-host side. She just had incredible insights. She's able to take huge concepts and break them down into small chunks for regular consumption. She will definitely be missed. And as the co-host of the Renew Mind podcast, if you're watching this, Maddie Madeline, you are more than welcome to jump back into the B mic seat, into the co-host seat. You are more than welcome to do that. There's always a seat open if you find the time, and if you want to not just be a guest but be a co-host. I would love for you to come back, but you will definitely be missed for sure. And so I wanted to take the time to do that. So if you don't see her on here, that is the reason why. So hopefully I will do a yeoman's work in picking up and doing some of the heavy lifting, but I just wanted to let everybody know that if you don't see her, that is the reason why, because of some of the things that she's trying to get done and complete. And of course, I definitely want to be support her for her being successful in that regard. So onward and upward. But if you ever get a chance, Maddie Madeline, if you want to come back and sit in the co-host chair, it is definitely open to you for sure. Okay, well, if you want to know how to reach the Renewed Mind podcast, you can reach us in several different ways. We are on social media as well as on email. You can reach us at email at the Renewed Mind Podcast at gmail.com, all one word. That is the Renewed Mind Podcast, spelled exactly like the show, at gmail.com. You can also reach us at Facebook at The Renewed Mind Podcast. That is the RE-NYOO-ED Mind Podcast, or The Renewed Mind on Facebook. You can also follow us on YouTube and Rumble at The Renewed Mind Podcast, on X with the same handle at The Renewed Mind Podcast, and on Instagram. We do have an Instagram account, and TikTok. That's where we post clips of the show, teaser clips, as well as the main highlights from the clips of the episode previous. And so you can find those there too on Instagram and TikTok at the Renewed Mind Podcast as well. So if you want to give us a follow there, then you are more than welcome to do that. The last topic, or the last review that we had for the last episode, was we went over a woman by the name of Katie Dale. We interviewed her, and that was an amazing interview. By the way, thank you so much again, Katie, for coming on too as well. Just having a wonderful discussion with us on bipolar disorder, and working and being involved in that. How do you talk to individuals? How do you counsel individuals with bipolar disorder? Of course, how do you approach an individual who's dealing with that particular challenge? And so we really appreciated Katie Dale's insight in her experience and what she has dealt with concerning this particular disorder. So thank you so much for that. And if you want to reach out to her or find her resources, katierdale.com is the website that she curates. We'll probably have her on at some time too in the future, but that was just a wonderful, wonderful interview. And if you have not seen it, I would encourage you to go back and take a look, watch that episode. It was really, really good, and it was very informative, I think. Okay, so let's go ahead and grease the skids and jump into our episode for today. Now, whenever I teach at a local fellowship, I usually call them Thinking Cap Sundays. Where there's a concept that requires a little bit of thought, a little bit of deep thought, a little bit of contemplation, a little bit of reflection, that some of the concepts may be a bit new, or they might be a bit more thorough, a little bit more of a deep dive. In this case, we're going to be talking about how the immaterial and the material work together. Now, if you have not um, seen our two previous episodes about the two aspects of humanity, material and immaterial, I would encourage you to go back and review that episode first, because a lot of the points that were made in that episode are going to be brought into this episode. So if you are hearing this episode or watching this episode and you're going, I'm confused. What is this about the material? What is this about the immaterial? Why is he talking about the brain? Why is he talking about the mind? Why are they different? I would encourage you to go back and watch that New Mind podcast episode concerning the two aspects of humanity, the two aspects of a human being. And then that will give you a little bit of clarity. So when you come back and listen to this, then you'll go, oh, I see. Okay, I got you. I get it now. Another episode that you might want to watch before this too is the one a couple of weeks ago that I did when I reviewed a article from a woman by the name of Miss Rainier. She is a Christian counselor that resides in the Raleigh area, South Carolina. She had wrote a article, and we walked through some of the strengths of her article and some of the things that should have been a little bit clear in terms of her position. And I had mentioned that her shortcoming was that she viewed the Bible as mostly redemptive. And because of that, she was coming to some conclusions that I think fell a little short in terms of defending psychology and the scriptures and how they are harmonized well. And so you might want to also watch that particular episode too, because some of the concepts and things too that I will be mentioning within this episode will also be brought up here from that previous episode. So without further ado, yes, if you haven't had a chance to watch those two episodes, the two aspects of humankind and Christian counseling and the biblical perspective, I would highly encourage you to look at those particular episodes, because they're going to be relevant for this episode today. Let's grease the skids and review a couple of terms before we actually get into the nitty-gritty of our text. And I mentioned it particularly in the episode where I critiqued Mrs. Rainier's article, was she didn't make a distinction between what secular was and psychology. She was kind of blending those two, or making those two terms synonymous. Secular just means a perspective, whatever perspective, without God as being the explanatory power or the explanation of the creation of all things. So in secular psychology starts with the premise that God is not, that God had no hand in creating humankind or the soul or anything else like that. And because there are some people that prescribe to that particular perspective, they come to certain conclusions about humankind, specifically that humankind is only material, and that humankind is not immaterial. So a person who subscribes to a secular worldview or a secular perspective will understand that humankind is nothing but synapses and dendrites and blood vessels and capillaries and nerves and all of these things. It's just only material, and there is no immaterial aspect to humanity. So remember, the difference between biblical is that for those who have a biblical perspective, such as myself, we start with the premise that God is, that God exists, and that God creates the material. He's created the material and he's created the immaterial based upon Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, that where God formed man from the dust of the ground, as Genesis chapter 2, verses 5 and following tells us, and that he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living nephesh. That Hebrew word nephesh is what we use to translate being or soul. We even looked at the Greek word in the Septuagint, that is the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, and we found that the word nephesh corresponds to the Greek word psyche, which is where we get the word psychology from. So exploring these differences matter, and they're going to matter in terms of how we see humankind, and that's going to impact how we counsel humankind as well. I made the case that secular humanists, or those who adopt secular psychological presuppositions, only see humanity as material and therefore will not consider the immaterial as something that is even important. Whereas the biblical position will strive to recognize that human beings consist of both aspects: material, those things that we can see, and immaterial, those things that we can't see. And this will be fleshed out, as a matter of fact, in this particular episode. Let's go ahead and jump into this and put this up on the screen. Today, we're going to be looking at kind of an instruction from Jesus that Luke, in his gospel, the book of Luke, writes concerning two individuals. So let me go ahead and put this up on the screen. So, before we get started, there are some people that would argue that this particular biblical account that we're going to research, or that we're going to talk about, is a metaphor that Jesus is using to describe a particular thing. Let me explain to you and walk you through why it's not. By the way, this resource is Blue Letter Bible. If you're not familiar with this resource, it is a fantastic resource, and it has tons of study materials, tons of resources. This is an excellent resource. So let me get to the reason why I don't think that I'm not convinced that this is a metaphor. It's not a metaphor. So let's take a look at another text. Let's look at Matthew 13. Matthew 13, verse 31. I'll go ahead and start at verse 24, and then we'll take a look at verse 31 a little closely. He says this, this is Jesus. He says this. He goes, Jesus presented another parable to them. That is the audience who he's addressing. He says, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went away. But when the wheat sprouted and bore grain, then the tares became evident also. The slaves of the landowner came in and said, Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares? That is, Jesus said to them, an enemy has done this. The slave said to him, do you want us then to go and gather them up? But he said, no, for while you are gathering up the tares, you may uproot the wheat with them. Allow both to grow together until the harvest, and in the time of harvest I will say to the reapers, first gather up the tares, and bind them in bundles, and burn them up, but gather the wheat into my barn. And then we get to verse 31. He presented another parable to them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and sowed into his field. And this is smaller than all the other seeds. When it is full grown, it is larger than the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and nest in its branches. So in this particular context here, Jesus is teaching parables, as we can see here that it's used in verse 24 and in statement 31 here, that it's a parable. And that's important because the word parable means throw along, to throw alongside. Parabole. Baleen means to throw. Para means alongside. So to throw alongside something. We don't find that here, the word parable used in this text in Luke 16. So that's one particular one particular thing we might want to notice about this text. Another thing here is the word may be compared, and also the word like. Let's take a look in verse 31. I'll pull up the Greek text here, and we've got this word here. All right, so this is another parable he presented to them, saying, basically to them. This word here is a fascinating word, homoia. This word, if we scroll down here to kind of find out where this word is, this is the one that's lit up, by the way. You can see, if you can follow, see all of the letters that are highlighted when you scroll down. This is the word right here, homoia. Homoios is the Greek word for this. This is the word that means like or similar to. So whenever you have a metaphor is a comparison between one thing to another. When you have a simile, which is what like or as, it is a comparison. That's, this thing is similar to this, or this thing is like this, or this thing is as this. That's the way this works. So homoia means same or similar. Another parable, he spoke to them saying, like or similar is the kingdom of the heavens. Well, why do I bring this up? Because this word here that is translated like in English is not found in Luke 16 either. So we don't see the word parable, paraboline, which means to throw alongside, and there's no comparative language within this particular text. So this cannot be a parable, nor can this be a metaphor. This is compared to this. And of course, there is no word such as like or similar to or compared in Luke 16 that we find in Matthew 13. So I believe that based upon the language, Jesus is talking about a for real scenario. This is something that is this is something that's real. This is not a comparison to something else. This is something that happened. Now let's go ahead and read verse 19 all the way to verse 31, and then I want to make some observations concerning this text. Let me go ahead and make this a little bigger. There we go. Let's go ahead and read this together, and we'll make some observations. Now there was a rich man, and he habitually dressed in purple and fine linen, joyously living in splendor every day. And a poor man named Lazarus was laid at his gate, covered with sores, and longing to be fed with crumbs, which were falling from the rich man's table. Besides, even the dogs were coming and licking his sores. Now the poor man died and was carried away by the angels to Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades he lifted up his eyes, being in torment, and saw Abraham far away and Lazarus in his bosom. And he cried out and said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus so he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool off my tongue, for I am agony in this flame. But Abraham said, Child, remember that during your life you received your good things, and likewise Lazarus bad things. But now he's being comforted here, and you are in agony. And besides all this, between us and you there is a great chasm fixed, so that those who wish to come over from here to you will not be able, and that none may cross over from there to us. And he said, Then I beg you, Father, that you send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, in order that he may warn them, so that they will not come to this place of torment. But Abraham said, They have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them. But he said, No, Father Abraham, if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent. But he said to them, If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be persuaded, even if someone rises from the dead. And that is where the teaching ends. What is fascinating about this, let's go back up to the top and then look at some details of this particular instruction that Jesus is giving to the people that he's teaching. Now he says, Now there was a rich man, and he habitually dressed in purple and fine linen, joyously living in splendor every day. We see that there's a physical aspect here. He's habitually dressed in purple and fine linen. By the way, this underscores how wealthy this rich man is, because in order to get fine linen and purple clothes dyed in purple dye, that's very, very expensive. This individual is a rich man, and he is displaying his wealth in how he dresses. We also see that his lifestyle was at ease. When it says he was joyously living in splendor every day. So he had the best food, he had the best clothes, he was dressed to the nines. I mean, he was looking really, really good. And then we have a poor man named Lazarus who was laid at his gate before his residence. And so we have this comparison, this physical comparison of this rich man who was dressed down, looking real nice, sharp, clean, was fed pretty well. He's living in comfort. And every day he has no care or worry in the world. And yet we find this poor man whose name is Lazarus. This is not the same Lazarus that Jesus rose from the dead. This was a different Lazarus. And he's laid at his gate covered with sores. So this man is poor. He is destitute. He's having problems with his health, and he is laid at his gate. He has no residence where which he can lay his head, and he's a vagabond. He's covered with sores and longing to be fed with the crumbs which were falling from the rich man's table. So again, while the rich man was satiated, the poor man was not, and he was longing to be fed even from the crumbs of the rich man's table. And even the dogs were coming and licking his sores, so he is down bad. His sores break and there's all types of fluids coming out of there. So he is very, very ill and very sick. Now, what's interesting is that there's a change in the trajectory of the instruction. So we have the rich man, we have the poor man, and we have both of their states in position. Now, the poor man dies physically, and he is carried away to the angels to Abraham's bosom. And the rich man died and was buried. So we see that both the poor man and the rich man, they are both physically dead. Now, what's interesting about this is it says that the rich man was buried, but the poor man wasn't. That's pretty important because the rich man has a place to basically have a proper burial. The poor man died, and was more than likely his body was carried outside of the city and thrown into the trash heap. But the rich man, he died. He physically died and was buried. He was placed in the ground. And so both individuals, both people are dead physically. Their bodies have expired and they're dead. Now, what's interesting about this is in the next statement that Jesus says. He says this, and this is concerning the rich man. It says, in Hades, he lifted up his eyes, being in torment, and saw Abraham far away and Lazarus in his bosom. Now, if you are following me concerning this particular account, you would notice something here. Is it true that the poor man died and the rich man died? That's true. That's in verse 22. The poor man was not buried, but the rich man was buried and put into the ground. So their physical faculties are buried in the ground or out in the trash heap as the poor man. And yet in the next line, we read, in Hades, he, that is the rich man, lifted up his eyes. Here's a question. How can he lift up his eyes when his eyes are buried in the ground? Remember, your eyes are physical. Your eyes are physical. You have your iris, you have your cornea, you have the eyeball itself that has all of those things, right? You have the muscles that are behind the eye that move the eye and center it and stabilize it and all these things. You have all of these physical components that make up the eye, which are important for sight. And yet we find that in verse 23, Jesus says that in the grave, in Hades, he lifted up his eyes. The word for eyes is ophthalmos, where we get the word optometry from. His eyes. How can he see when he has no eyes? It says, being in torment, and saw Abraham far away and Lazarus in his bosom. So he saw this with the eyes that he has even after his death. He's still able to see. How is that possible when he has no physical eyes? It doesn't say he's blind. It says that he saw Abraham far away, him lifting up his eyes. There's another thing, too, to mention that I might want to mention here. He says in Hades, that is the area where he is. He's in a location, by the way. So his existence extends beyond his physical body. So he is in a location and he has eyes to see, to physically see Abraham and Lazarus far away, a great distance. And it also mentions that he was in torment. Now, if he's in torment, what does that imply? That he can feel things. But wait a minute, though. If he can feel things, don't you need nerves for that? Nerve endings and a central nervous system, don't you need nerves for that? Physical nerves that detect pain? Well, wait a minute. His physical body with all of his nerves is in the ground. He died and was buried. How can he sense pain with no pain receptors? How would he be aware that he is in torment with no pain receptors? So right at the jump in verse 23, we see a couple of things. One, we see location, where he's located at. Two, we mention existence, that he is present in that location. Three, that he has eyes to see. Even though he doesn't have physical eyes, he's dead and buried in the ground. And we see that he's able to sense and have an awareness of pain, being in torment. This is fascinating. Let's continue here. In chapter 16, verse 24, we read the following. It says, "And he," that is the rich man, "cried out," basically screamed, and said, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me. Send Lazarus so that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool off my tongue, for I am in agony in this flame." So once more again, we see that he has an awareness of pain. Again, he has no body, therefore he has no pain receptors, yet he can sense his agony in flame in this place. Another thing too to mention, notice he says he cried out and said, "Father Abraham." He is talking in language. He is talking in language. He is speaking in language. "Father Abraham, have mercy on me." Another thing is too, what else do you need to talk? What else do you need to speak? Well, not only do you need an understanding of language and the language that you're familiar with, but you also need a little muscle called the tongue to speak. He says that he sent Lazarus so he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool off my tongue. Wait a minute. I thought the tongue was physical, right? I mean, it's right. Mine's is right here. Mine's is right here, but yet, where is his body? It's buried in the ground. Isn't his tongue buried with his body? And yet we find that this individual, the rich man, whom we don't know his name, he screams and he speaks and he requests comfort by Lazarus dipping the tip of his finger. Wait a minute, digits. Finger. Well, I know I have physical fingers, right? But yet the rich man is able to recognize that Lazarus has fingers, but yet Lazarus died. His body is also removed. How can he have fingers if his body's removed? And Lazarus mentions a tongue. How can you have a tongue when your body's in the ground and buried? But it gets even better in verse 25, the statement here, Jesus continuing here to tell us about this particular scenario. "But Abraham replied, 'Child, remember that during your life you received your good things, and likewise Lazarus bad things. But now he's being comforted here, and you're in agony.'" So think about this here. This is kind of amazing. This word "remember" is the word to recall, to actively recall something, an event, a particular memorial, a practice, or something like that. Abraham is telling him to recall his life, that he was in comfort. He received good things. We see this here, that he was joyously living in splendor. He got good things. And we see that Lazarus had bad things physically that was happening to him that occurred. Think about this. He says to remember, to recall. Well, this is interesting. How can the rich man remember when his brain is in the ground? Now, I remember way back when in my studies, reading the textbooks that I had, that the brain is responsible for memory, that it holds or retains memory. And a lot of that has to deal with the fact that, not only the activity that we see when a person remembers or recalls things, certain areas of the brain lights up. And we can also see something like this in terms of when an individual has dementia or things like that, and they can't recall certain things. They can't recall their children's names or their addresses or where they live, how old they are. And, of course, being a degenerative disorder, the more severe it gets, the more, they lose the ability to think and remember and recall things. But what I find interesting is we're not talking about the physical. We're not talking about the physical aspect of a person, because the physical aspect of a person was already addressed in the statement in verse 22, that the rich man died and buried, and the poor man was buried. And yet we find that Abraham is telling him to recall. Remember that during your life you received good things. Remember that. Take those memories with you. Let them comfort you. How can he remember when there is no brain? How can he recall things? So this tells us something about the nature of humanity concerning beyond the grave, that one retains their cognitive function even when they have no brain. And of course, Abraham mentions his agony, the sensation that he is feeling while being in this particular state. And he also mentions Lazarus as being comforted as well. And I believe that he's being comforted in a real sense, even though Lazarus has no body. Matter of fact, I did not mention this, that the poor man died and was carried away by the angels to Abraham's bosom. He was carried. How can you carry someone when they have no body? This is kind of interesting. Again, if you can carry a baby because they have they're physical. You can carry a person if you're strong enough, and because physically speaking, materially speaking. But his body's in the ground. How is he carried away to this location, to Abraham's bosom? It gets better. Verse 26 here. And besides all this, between us and you, there is a great chasm fixed, so that those who desire or wish to come over from here to you will not be able, and that none may cross from over there to us. This is very fascinating here, because within this particular statement that Jesus is recounting concerning Abraham's discussion with this rich man, he says that there's a great chasm fixed, that there's a large area like a canyon that cannot be crossed. They can see each other, but they cannot cross. So, which is kind of interesting. He says, so that those who wish or desire to come from over here, you will not be able. So this is interesting. If there was a possibility for him to do so in the area that he's in, the rich man could build a bridge and walk over there if he wanted to. If it was possible for him to do so, he could build a bridge and walk from where his location is to the other location. That concerns movement. So wherever the rich man goes in the area that he's in, he is going to be in agony. Whereas wherever Lazarus goes, he will be comforted. And there is a great chasm or a great space fixed so that none can run, none can jump, none can build and go across there. How can he move when again his legs, his arms, how can he move when again he has no body? Again, we see memory here in verses 27 to 28. And he said, then I beg you, Father, that you send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, in order that he may warn them, so that they may not come to this place of torment. This is the rich man, or formerly the rich man, who is replying to Abraham. Think about this. They're having a dialogue too. A dialogue not only takes language, but it also takes understanding of language, understanding of the speech, the meaning of the words, things like that, so that the replies will be consistent back and forth as they talk to one another. But again, don't you need the brain for that? But where's his brain? The rich man's brain is buried. It's in the ground. So how can he understand him when the very brain that is used to understand him is missing? How's that possible? And again, we see memory here, for I have 5 brothers. I beg you, send them to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, in order that he may warn them, so that they may not come to this place of torment. We see a desire here. We see volition. We see will here. We see that the desire of this rich man who does not want his brothers to come to this place that he finds himself in. We have volition, we have will, we have intuition, we have cognition, we have all of that. But where is his brain? His brain is in the ground. It's buried. This is probably one of the most amazing texts because it shows us both aspects of humankind in the same passage. It is incredible how this is laid out. And this brings up an important thing. Again, I believe that this is an historical account. This is not a metaphor. There's no comparative language. Jesus is not comparing something to something else, and there is no like, there is no as, there is no it can be compared to this. There is nothing that in the language itself that tips us that this is metaphorical or symbolic or anything else like that. This is a literal thing that happened. One of the things that this brings up is the fact of the importance of the aspect of humanity, that humanity is physical, material, as we can see in statements in verses 19 to 22. And yet we see in verses 23 to 31, really, that the rich man, and I would even say Lazarus too, they have sight, they have hearing, because the rich man is replying to Abraham. You can't hear if you have no ears. Yet we see that his ears, that is the rich man's ears physically, are in the ground. They're buried. And yet he's able to hear and respond to Abraham. So we have all of the senses. We have touch and sensation with the underscoring of him being in agony and Lazarus being comforted. We have taste that the rich man, or the formerly rich man, is thirsty. Not only is he feeling pain, but he's feeling the dry mouth concerning wanting to satiate his thirst. We see that. We hear of a finger, take, at least have him take the finger in water and cool off my tongue. We see speaking. We see cognition, thinking, memory. We see a possible getting up and movement in verse 26, that if it was possible to move from one area to another, that could be possible, but due to the great chasm, the space in between them, that they're not able to do so. We see the speech still, that a person is still speaking and having a conversation, and yet there's no tongue. And there is no way that the rich man or Lazarus is in their physical body as it was before. This is incredible. This shows us that the immaterial can do all the things that the material does. It can sense, it can feel, it can be aware. Again, a secular perspective would not consider this to be they would consider this to be a fantastic narrative, that this is not real. But we've discussed at length, particularly with the two aspects of man, that God created the material and the immaterial. Now, how do they work together? I am convinced that the material and the immaterial are harmonized together when they are unified together. In this one, they're not unified. The rich man died and was carried to Abraham's bosom, and the rich man died and was buried. But just because they're not in their physical body, that doesn't mean that all of the sensations, the cognition, all of the intuition, the will, the volition, the sights, the sounds, the sensations, that all of that goes away. That our immaterial, our spirit feels, thinks, reasons, speaks, hears, all of that the body harmonizes with the material, harmonizes with the immaterial. It harmonizes with it. This is very, very important to understand, that our bodies, our physical bodies, and our immaterial state, they harmonize together. They work together. It's kind of interesting when I talk to individuals about this, and they bring up brain scans, that we can see thinking or how one is thinking by the way of brain scans, right? So they put it under a CAT scan or an fMRI. You can see the activity of the brain as one is thinking. And I often ask, is the activity that we see in the brain, is it the source? In other words, is the brain the source of the thinking, or is it a reflection of the activity that's occurring? And I say, from my worldview, I think of the brain as an interface. It is an interface. So think of like the cell phone here. We would never think that the picture that we see here is being produced by the glass. The glass on the cell phone is not producing the image. The glass kind of reflects the image, but the image is not, the glass isn't the source of the image. The glass is just an interface. That's all it is. I would say that the brain is it harmonizes, it works with the immaterial. Our bodies work with the immaterial. They are unified, they are harmonized together. And so just like, when you have a phone that is kind of out of order, because, you need both the material to harmonize with the immaterial. When the material doesn't work well, then it kind of creates problems for the immaterial. For instance, in degenerative diseases, the brain has a hard time harmonizing with the immaterial because the material is being broken down. It's out of order. And so I would say that when it comes to this particular aspect of humanity, we ought to think about this for a minute. Let's look at a couple of more scriptures, and then we'll kind of close this out here. So counselors working with a biblical worldview ought to be concerned about the material aspect of a person, because the material is very important. God created it. We ought to know what type of medications they're taking. Now, that doesn't mean that we can prescribe or anything else like that, but particularly if you're working in the local church. But I think it would be important for you to know what type of medications they're taking and for what purpose, for what reason. Are they antidepressants? Are they antipsychotics? Are they anti-anxiety? Are they cholesterol pills? Do they regulate the blood sugar? Things like that, because that will give us important information that we need to know about them and possibly their presenting problem. Now, again, we can't diagnose or anything else like that, particularly if you're not licensed or anything else like that. But I think it's important to know what they're taking, because that might impact their material, and kind of how and we can use that information to assess what we can do with the area of expertise that we have. So I think that's important. It's important to understand that, to understand that knowledge, because that knowledge concerns the person that's sitting in front of us with their material state. However, what are we to do? How do we counsel an immaterial aspect of a person? For this, I would like to go to 1 Corinthians 2. There's a very fascinating statement that Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 2 that I would like to discuss right quick. Okay, 1 Corinthians 2. Again, Paul is making the case, essentially the saints of Corinth are kind of playing, my teacher's better than your teacher. And Paul goes, you shouldn't be thinking like that, right? Because all of us have the same message. The message is what you need to be focused on, not the teacher. We are mere servants of you. And really, the glory belongs to the source of the person who gave us the message. He goes, we're not the source. The source actually is God and his wisdom. That's really who you should be acknowledging. And Paul writes something that's very interesting, and he makes a comparison. It's rather fascinating. I'll start at verse 1. He goes, "And when I came to you, brethren, I did not come with superiority of speech or of wisdom, proclaiming to you the testimony of God. For I determined to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I was with you in weakness and in fear and much trembling. And my message and my preaching were not in persuasive words of wisdom, but in the demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith will not rest upon the wisdom of men, but the power of God. Yet we do speak wisdom among those who are mature, a wisdom, however, not of this age, nor of the rulers of this age who are passing away. But we speak God's wisdom in a mystery, the hidden which God predestined before the ages to our glory, the wisdom which none of the rulers of this age have understood. For if they understood it, they would have not crucified the Lord of glory. But just as it is written, the things which the eye has not seen, or ear has not heard, and which have not entered the heart of man, that all that God has prepared for those who love him. For to us God revealed them through the Spirit, that is the Holy Spirit. For the Spirit searches all things, even the depths of God." Not a problem. This is the part that is the coup de grace. "For who among men knows the thoughts of a man except the spirit of a man which is in him? Even so, the thoughts of God no one knows except the Spirit of God." This is a fascinating statement that Paul makes, because he compares the human spirit to God's Spirit in terms of one's thoughts. That Paul doesn't write that the source of one's thinking and their thoughts originate from the material. Otherwise, he would have wrote that. Instead, he writes that the source of the thoughts of a human being derive from the immaterial, the spirit of a man. So Paul writes and compares, basically, God has let us know what he's thinking by his Spirit, just as you wouldn't know what I was thinking unless I told you. I would tell you what I was thinking. The source of my thinking does not come from my brain. It comes from my spirit, from the immaterial. That is fascinating. It is amazing that he mentions this, because again, this underscores something about the nature of human beings. That again, we are not only material, but we are material and immaterial, and that the source of our thinking and understanding and all of that comes from, or finds its origin in, the immaterial. That is amazing. So How do we work with the immaterial? Well, it's rather simple. When we deal with someone's negative thoughts, we are dealing in a large part one's immaterial nature in how they think. When we are dealing with one's perception, one's outlook, we are dealing with a person's immaterial state, which of course is impacting their material state too. I mean, we can't get around that, because remember, both the material and immaterial are harmonized. But the source of one's thinking is immaterial. This is why us as counselors who work from a biblical perspective, we cannot look at humankind as merely one-sided. That when we are dealing with individuals' physical states and we're giving them recommendations to doctors and to specialists and things like that, we are in one sense working primarily with the material, because we're giving them resources and things like that, kind of the helping the weak, the asthenes. When Paul gives the prescription to take a little wine to Timothy for his frequent ailments, that's material. He's using a material issue to resolve a material problem, or he's using a material solution to resolve a material issue. But when it comes to our thinking and our understanding, our perception of things, our outlook, our beliefs, what we hold to be true and real concerning our understanding of things, that is sourced in the immaterial. And so when we challenge those things as counselors, we are literally working with a person's immaterial state, which will have impact in their physical or their material state. So the activity of thinking and of the mind is immaterial. And when we work with someone's perspective, when we work with someone's belief system, when we work with someone's thinking, how they're thinking about themselves in their particular situations, we are primarily working with their immaterial, which is so fascinating. It is amazing to think that counselors who work from a biblical perspective impact the immaterial by the way that we address one's thinking, one's understanding, one's perception, one's outlook, one's worldview, one's philosophical position. It's just amazing. So when I say that we have a more comprehensive approach, this is what I mean. Us as individuals who are working from a biblical perspective, we are the true studiers of the whole being, because we acknowledge that humanity is not only material, but that humanity is material and immaterial. We have a true understanding of the nature of nefeshology, or psychology, the study and discourse of the whole person. Oh, so amazing. Well, so let me say this. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, in large part works with the immaterial and the material, because cognition is a large part a function of the mind, which is immaterial, which is housed in the spirit. Of course, how one's thinking impacts one's actions. Behavioral is, in large part, material. That's what we see when we're looking at somebody. We expect one's thinking to impact one's actions. But there are other ones too. Again, when a person believes scripture and understands scripture and understands wisdom and how they're supposed to operate in that wisdom, the information that is given by God as he has revealed it in his word is to impact our mind, our thinking, understanding, our heart, where the location of understanding and thinking are located. And so again, being a counselor working from a biblical position gives us an incredible opportunity to work with both aspects of humanity and not just one. Whereas the secularists, they prevent themselves from working with the immaterial. Or they may work with the immaterial if they use methods and models and things like that to have a person's thinking be impacted. But the challenge is that they don't impact them with the truth of God's word. Or they may acknowledge the truth, but not the source of it. And that's a problem, because their worldview won't allow them to acknowledge that aspect, which is unfortunate. Well, I hope that this was informative and enlightening for you. Again, if this is a little lofty or a little erudite for you, I don't mean it to be. I would highly encourage you to go back and see the episode concerning the two aspects of humanity, material and immaterial, and talking about that phenomena. And I would also encourage you to go back and look at that episode concerning Mrs. Rainier and working through that article that she wrote about integration of the Bible with secular practices. I think that you would find those not only highly informative, but this would help grease the skids for understanding this a little bit more clearly if you had some challenges doing that. So I would encourage you to do that. If you have any comments or anything, please share them. Comment down below. If you're watching this on YouTube or on Rumble, or please shoot me an email at the renewed mind podcast at gmail.com. I would really like to hear your thoughts. Do you find that this is more informative, more comprehensive? Is there maybe another thing that we can add to the discussion concerning the substance and nature of humanity? Please, if you want to, please send me an email, and we will certainly, if we get it, we'll certainly address it on the show as well and read it and comment on it appropriately for sure. You can also follow us on Facebook as well. That is at the Renewed Mind Podcast. That is THERE-NYOO-ED mind. Don't forget those dashes when you're going on Facebook. You can also follow us on the YouTube and Rumble and X, as well as Instagram and TikTok at the Renewed Mind Podcast, all one word. They all have the same handle. And please, if you find this informative and if you find this helpful at all, I would like for you to become an advocate for us and hit the subscribe button. That lets us know that you like it. And if I've definitely earned your subscription, please consider becoming an advocate along with us. That helps the information get out in a more broad area. And if you find time, please share it and pass this along as well to those who might be interested in this particular topic and subject concerning counseling, psychology, and the biblical perspective. So, the next episode, we will discuss another important topic concerning counseling, particularly biblical counseling, is the topic of forgiveness. And I want to flesh out this particular topic and what does it mean to forgive a person? What does forgiveness look like? And how can we, as counselors who work from a biblical position, or our biblical counselors, take this particular concept and make it more clear for those who we guide and advise in this particular aspect. So I think we'll just wrap up this episode. My name is Dr. Luther Smith, and you are listening to the Renewed Mind Podcast. Take care, grace and peace, and I will catch you on the next episode. All right, take care. Bye-bye.